Principles and Practices for Inclusive Teaching, presented by Dr. Tazin Daniels. Dr. Daniels is an educational developer, speaker, consultant, and coach. She works full-time as an assistant director at the Center for Research on Learning and Teaching at the University of Michigan and is a digital equity expert with the Every Learner Everywhere Network. She holds a PhD in anthropology and specializes in inclusive, equitable, and anti-racist teaching practices. Welcome, Dr. Daniels.
Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Tazin Daniels and I'm an assistant director at the Center for Research on Learning and Teaching at the University of Michigan, and I'm also an equitable digital learning expert with the Every Learner Everywhere Network. Today I want to give you a lightning quick introduction to principles and practices for inclusive teaching. These principles and practices can be applied to online, hybrid, flipped, or face-to-face classrooms. And while I won't be able to cover everything, hopefully this will give us a nice foundation for some discussion in our session today. So at the University of Michigan, we have been thinking about inclusive teaching for a very long time. And over time, we have developed a series of definitions that are constantly evolving based on what we're discovering are best principles and practices for this type of teaching. And so today I do want to start by rooting our conversation in a definition and breaking down some of those things from you. So in order to be inclusive and accessible, I am going to read this definition out loud. So first, inclusive teaching involves deliberately cultivating a learning environment where all students are treated equitably, have access to learning, and feel valued and supported in their learning. Such teaching attends to social identities and seeks to change the ways that systemic inequities shape interactions in teaching and learning spaces, affect individual experiences of those spaces, and influence course and curriculum design. So a few things to note about this definition. First is that it's relevant in every discipline, whatever your content. And so I know a lot of folks who are in the social sciences or humanities might be teaching courses that are explicitly focused on social identity, race, gender. And so that feels like, oh, okay, like it's very much related to my content. But even folks who are teaching in STEM courses, math, engineering, physics, recognize that teaching is not just about the content, but it's also about the people and the experiences that are in your room. So even though you're not teaching about social identity, you and your students have social identities, and those are going to impact your experience of the learning environment. And so the practices that we're going to talk about today are widely applicable across disciplines. A second is that inclusive teaching requires intentional practice over time. So when we say deliberately cultivate, we mean just that. It's intention and it's over time. So one participant in a workshop has stated, teaching inclusively is a mindset. You can't just think about it once and be done. And I think that that's very true. Although I am going to provide some examples of practices that you could employ right away, realize that it really is about adopting those principles. So regardless of what situation you're in, you have guideposts about which way to move to make sure that you're making the most inclusive decision. In other words, it's not enough to just be a good person or a good teacher. There really are a lot of considerations when it comes to making pedagogical decisions towards equity and inclusion. Third, inclusive teaching does not describe any particular pedagogical approach, but names a foundational intention that shapes your approach, whether you're lecturing, leading discussion, holding office hours, or facilitating a team-based learning course. So again, this goes back to the idea of developing a mindset. And that mindset is something that should transcend the classroom walls. And so regardless of whether you're teaching in a lecture or if it's in office hours or some other setting where you're engaging with students or peers, you use those inclusive teaching principles widely so that you are being incredibly thoughtful and productive in the interactions that you are participating in. And I think that's especially true if you're in a discipline that is overrepresented in terms of social identities, and you're engaging with folks who hold other social identities, making sure that you're being as inclusive as possible. Number 4, finally, instructor awareness about the ways that bias and systemic inequities such as sexism, racism, ableism, etc. influence student access and experiences within specific disciplines and institutions, as well as higher education more generally. And so this really is a call to action to note that inclusive teaching practices don't exist in a vacuum. You really need to be aware of what those systems of inequity are and how those influence your students' experiences, and perhaps even your own. Something that I always like to remind my clients and my participants is that social identities are never the problem, right? For me, I identify as a woman of color. Being brown is not the problem. Being brown in a systemically racist society is the problem. And so really realizing what those challenges could be to your students, so we steer away from like a deficit model of thinking, oh, these particular folks need more attention and more help because they're brown, or because they're international, or because they're women, or, you know, what other insert category here, but instead really focusing on the fact that it is those systems of inequity that are the problem, and it's about really removing barriers to learning. So in the remainder of our time together, I really want to focus on 5 different principles for inclusive teaching. And I will provide a link to a website which gives you a full list of strategies around each of these, but for the sake of this presentation, I just want to kind of go through each one of them pretty quickly. So the first is transparency, which is clearly communicating with students about expectations, norms, explaining purpose, task, and criteria for learning activities. I like to call this the hidden curriculum. So there are certain things, implicit assumptions that we have that students just kind of know how to do things, like how to ask for help or what their role is in the classroom. So instead, I want us to think about how do we make an even playing field for any student, especially students who are first generation or are international or may not have that insider knowledge. So some examples of practices could include communicating the sense of the instructors and students' respective roles in shaping and guiding class discussions, clarifying how you'd like students to address you, especially if you teach students from a range of educational and cultural backgrounds, dedicating time in class for students to ask questions about assignments and expectations, and offering guidance on how students ought to allocate time on assignments and prioritize various out-of-class tasks. By doing this, you're really removing any kind of implicit biases or assumptions that students just kind of know what the rules of the game are. And instead, you're really having a conversation with them and inviting them to really be active participants in their own learning. The second principle is academic belonging. So this is about cultivating students' sense of connection to and ability to see themselves in the discipline or profession, your course or community of scholars, which includes your class or campus. Research shows that academic belonging is one of the most pivotal factors in determining success, not just for students, but also for faculty, especially minoritized faculty or faculty of color. And so some ways for you to really promote this sense of belonging, that this is, not only a place where they belong, but can thrive, include the following. So emphasizing the range of identities and backgrounds of experts who've contributed to your field and or sponsored discussions about the reasons for a history of limited access to the field. So really showcasing diversity or being transparent about why there isn't as much diversity that you can showcase. Assessing students' prior knowledge about their field and topics so you can accurately align instruction with their strengths and needs. In class, avoid generalizations that may not include all students. It might include assumptions about life experience, economic means, or future goals, right? So having common points of reference. And finally, allowing for productive risk and failure, emphasizing that struggle and challenge are important parts of the learning process rather than signs of student deficiency. These are all things that can also foster what we call growth mindset, right? The idea that people are not inherently good or bad or doomed to be unsuccessful in certain fields, but in fact that risk-taking and experimentation and failure are normal parts of the academic process and are not an indication of one's value or worth in higher education. The third principle is structured interactions. And so this involves developing protocols or processes that support equitable access and contributions to interactive elements of the learning environment and disrupt patterns that reinforce systemic inequities. Another way of thinking about this is you don't leave things up to chance. We don't just assume that students are going to put themselves into neatly formed strategic groups, or that they'll know exactly what's the best way to communicate and be respectful of one another. You build systems and structures. And so some examples include developing discussion guidelines or community agreements about a class or studio interactions, in facilitated discussions using strategies that are more inclusive of a range of voices, such as taking a cue, asking to hear from those who have not already spoken, waiting until several hands are raised to call on anyone, or using paired or small group conversations to seed larger discussions. When possible, assign student groups and teams that help leverage diversity and avoid isolating students from underrepresented identities. That's an important one. And then finally, during long-term group or team projects, provide a process for students to reflect upon teamwork and dynamics and provide constructive feedback to one another. A key thing here is that we are implicitly assuming that teamwork and collaboration and communication are implicit learning objectives for students. We want them to learn how to work well together. I would challenge you to think about ways to make those explicit learning objectives. Let them reflect and practice those skills of collaboration, conflict resolution, and communication, and give them feedback on it along the way. Next is critically engaging difference. So this is acknowledging students' different identities and experiences and leveraging student diversity as an asset for learning. So again, not thinking of the deficit model of, oh, you're different, so I have to set up special accommodations, but really thinking about how difference can be an advantage to everybody in the room. So some ways to do this are to reflect and share the ways that your own identities as the instructor shape your relationship to your work, the discipline, including your potential assumptions and biases about students. So how are you thinking about your own differences with and among your students? Using a background questionnaire early in the term to learn about individual students' past academic experiences, goals, concerns, or other information that would be useful for you to know as their teacher. This is just about getting to know students, and you can use this information in really great ways, such as forming student teams and knowing who are the students that might need a little bit of time and attention along the way. Presenting course materials in a variety of modalities, such as readings, diagrams, lectures, podcasts, rather than relying on one mode of engagement. And then finally, deliberately choosing course materials and activities with a range of student physical abilities and financial resources in mind. So this really is bringing the equity approach in. We're not just assuming that all students are the same and we're going to treat them equally, but really acknowledging and honoring and attending to the differences that students bring to the classroom. And seeing that as a point of advantage. And finally, flexibility. This one has been particularly important, especially as we made the switch to emergency remote teaching, and we think about ways to bring flexibility into the college classroom, whether it's face-to-face or online. So this means responding to and adapting to students' changing and diverse circumstances, engaging empathetically with student needs, both emerging and persistent, and balancing intentional design and commitment to providing accommodations. So some examples of this include clearly articulating course learning objectives so that you can make deliberate decisions about what elements of the course can be revised, adapted, or made optional in response to individual and/or collective student needs. So when push comes to shove and you have to cut something or add something on, if you know your learning objectives, you will be able to make informed decisions on what to keep and what to move or to change. Building in opportunities for student choice. So things like flexible or self-paced deadlines for assignments, multiple options or topics and modalities for assignments, optional opportunities for instructor or peer feedback on drafts. These are all things that give students a little bit more agency over what kind of learning experience will best meet their needs in that moment. Design course policies that provide clear pathways if students need to be absent, turn in late work, leave class early, etc. Explain how these are designed to support student learning when unforeseen circumstances arrive, and avoid framing such policies as simply punitive. It's okay to have rules in your course, but I think you have to be really understanding of the ways that some students may or may not be able to meet those expectations. So a key thing here is to have an open line of communication and invite feedback from students to see how likely it is that they can meet your expectations. And then finally, regularly assess student understanding of key course concepts so you can provide relevant instruction or access to supplementary materials to fill in common gaps. So again, open lines of communication. Make sure that you're constantly in contact with your students so that you can adapt and be flexible as needed. So those are the 5 principles for inclusive teaching that I wanted to just fly through today. Again, I'll provide a link with the full list of strategies that you can peruse at your own convenience. I look forward to chatting with you in the synchronous portion of this workshop. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Daniels. I see we have some questions from the audience, and just a reminder to go ahead and submit any additional questions in the Q&A tab. So our first question is, what are some ways we can get more instructors to teach inclusively?
Thanks so much, Blaine. So I would say that is one of the most popular questions that I get in workshops like this. Typically, we tend to attract folks who are, as we like to say, already a part of the choir, who are here because they already have an invested interest in inclusive teaching. Perhaps they are experts like you and I in this. And I know that they're the ones who are interested in how do we get those folks who really need to be in the conversation involved. I think we can all think of who, a few of those faculty and instructors are. But what I really like to do is focus on what I'd call the middle third. The middle third are the people who are around you who understand that teaching with equity in mind is important, but they don't have the confidence or the skill set or the time or the resources to be able to do that. And so for me, as an educational developer that works at a teaching center and also as an instructor, those are the folks that I really look out for, because I think getting people involved is about building a critical mass. And as we know, students are no longer just kind of accepting the status quo. They're really advocating for themselves in inclusive teaching. And so I think it's about finding the right audience and getting those people involved. I would also say that in terms of on an administrative level, it is about creating accountability and incentives. So a little bit of carrot, a little bit of stick. So things like rewarding people for the good work that they're doing, identifying the champions in your unit who are, getting those great learning outcomes and feedbacks from students, and having them share the good work that they're doing and rewarding them, whether it's through awards or teaching fellowships or opportunities for scholarship, et cetera. So those are, I think, some really concrete ways that you can do that. And then for folks who are maybe a little bit behind in terms of their investments or their interests or their prioritization of these things, I think really it's a matter of time before folks really start to realize that, the status quo is just not going to cut it anymore.
Definitely. Another question we have is, do you have any specific suggestions on how to do this in first-year seminars for brand new college students, or on common pitfalls for that particular cohort?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think especially the first few set of principles around transparency and academic belonging are particularly important for first-generation students or freshman seminars. I think I mentioned this in the talk, the idea of the hidden curriculum. For me, even though I was an international person coming here, I'm a first generation or 1.5 generation US citizen. My father went through the higher education process. And so I did have an advantage understanding the language, understanding things like, for example, office hours are not a place for bad students, but actually attending office hours is how you get on the radar of professors, and that's how you get recommendation letters, and that's how you get to join labs and find out about opportunities. Those are the kinds of insider curriculum, tips and tricks and strategies that we need to really be sharing with first generation students in freshman seminar. Things like, how do you ask for a letter of recommendation? How do you choose the right extracurricular activities? Which ones are going to really benefit you in the long term versus in the short term. And so I think really outlining what those competencies are for that group is important. And the other thing I would say too is that, I mentioned this a little bit in the talk, but I'll say it again, is that a lot of times when we think about freshman seminar and students who come from low income or poverty impacted households or our first generation, we tend to lean towards the deficit model and thinking about how can I help these students? What are the special needs of these students? And a way that I have reframed that for myself is, what are the barriers that are in these students' way? Right? What are the systemic barriers that are preventing them from accessing the same kind of education that everybody else who is a quote unquote traditional student already has access to. And so my job is not about helping them, but it's about removing barriers and really identifying and figuring out what I can do.
Great. We have another interesting question. So some instructors worry that if they're too flexible, they won't be rigorous enough and that students won't be challenged. What would you say to those instructors?
That's so interesting. I actually recently gave a keynote exactly on this topic around rigor versus flexibility. And I think there's a couple of things that we have to keep in mind. So when we think about, what are our concerns as instructors when it comes to rigor? A lot of times folks are worried that either it will compromise the integrity of our field, right? We can't just pass everybody and make it easy. Sometimes folks are afraid that they're being taken advantage of. I mean, that's a real emotional, cognitive struggle, right? If I'm too easy, are students just going to take advantage of me and my niceness? Some folks are worried about academic dishonesty, right? So the idea that if I'm too easy and too lenient, people will cheat, and that's not fair. But what I would say is that we really need to look at the reality of the situation and understand that there's actually research and science that explains certain behaviors and assumptions when it comes to students. So in terms of rigor, how do we measure rigor? We measure rigor in terms of learning outcomes, right? Are people actually able to demonstrate that they've learned or developed or adapted the skills that they have? And that doesn't have to do with how hard it was, but it really has to do with having an equity-minded approach to assessment. And so I think and a lot of the work that my colleagues have been doing lately, especially since the pandemic, has been looking at like kind of traditional assessment practices and how that only further creates like inequities. We also know that research shows that students who feel like a lack of sense of belonging, they feel anonymous, they feel high competition, high anxiety, those are the folks who end up defaulting to academic dishonesty. And so there are things that we can do if we really focus on the learning over the grading that can really remove some of those potential pitfalls. I also think that we have to think about the costs and benefits, and the idea of being a hard grader or having strict policies who is it really serving? I think that there's a point in which flexibility can be detrimental to instructors' well-being and mental health, right? Sometimes we have to have deadlines because it's so that we can get our grading done and we have expectations. And so the best way, I think, to accommodate all of those different tensions is just to have open lines of communication with students. If there are things that you're going to be strict about, you need to explain to them why. And you need to also be willing to hear whether or not they can meet those expectations and then adjust accordingly. Because a lot of times folks will have assumptions that certain practices mean certain things. For example, the conversation around video cameras. Remember this? It is, and it continues to be a big thing. Oh, my students don't have their cameras on, which means that they're not really paying attention. Well, for me, maybe it feels that way because I don't want to be in a room where I can't see anyone and I don't have my audience. It could feel uncomfortable. But also, just because somebody's camera is on does not mean that they're actively engaged in paying attention, right? And so I think we really do have to disassociate some of those like normalized behaviors and practices from measures of actual learning. So those are just a couple of examples I think that might be able to help tease that apart.
Great. Another question, what are some of the easiest strategies to implement that make the biggest difference?
Yeah, so I truly believe that, especially like some parts of the definition that I shared around the idea that it's not just a one and done thing when it comes to inclusive teaching. It really is about setting a tone for inclusion and setting an environment for inclusion. And I think some ways that you can set the tone, first and foremost, is to include a statement in your syllabus. We're all continuing to learn. I know our first set of presenters also mentioned that the idea of being called an expert can feel uncomfortable. But I think that if one of your goals as an instructor is to be, professionally developing yourself in the area of inclusive and equity-minded teaching, that's something you should share with your students. Tell them what that means to you, why that's a priority. What are specific things that you're working on? Why is having an important or an inclusive climate imperative to you and your well-being as a teacher, as well as the students that you're caring for. And I think that, and that comes directly out of, a branch of literature around pedagogies of care and really focusing on the instructor-student relationship. And there's research that shows that that actually does lead to improved learning outcomes when students really feel that sense of care and commitment from teachers. The other nice thing about putting something in your syllabus and also potentially on the first day of class sharing your inclusive teaching philosophy is that you can open a space for dialogue. So when you invariably make a mistake, and you will, I continue to make mistakes as even though I am an expert in this, it leaves a pathway for people to bring that up with you so that you can have that learning opportunity and students don't feel silenced. In addition to that, I would say get to know your students. I know that can be really hard in a virtual environment or if you're teaching one of those really big introduction classes. But some easy ways to do that are to have an intake survey where you're asking for some critical information about students' backgrounds, experiences, expectations, and goals. I often will ask a question at a number of my workshops, which is, for instructors, tell me about like the instructor who you felt cared the most about you or like was the biggest mentor in your life. And what did they do to make you feel cared for? And the number one response was that they were interested in me. They wanted to know what my goals were. And I think that really using that as an opportunity, whether it's an intake survey, whether it's an introduction video, and actually taking the time to respond to each of those, again, creates pathways for communication. And then beyond that, as I mentioned, I put the link in the chat. You can see a lot of the other strategies that will be applicable specifically to different contexts.
Thank you so much. You have really shared just so many wonderful resources. So again, I want to thank Dr. Daniels for joining us today and sharing her insights on inclusive teaching principles and practices.